Kid of Arcadia, Part 2, Chapter 6, Corner Boy and the Other Son. Things get weird when you have a fever. It's like your skin can feel all the subtle changes in temperature and light even when your tongue can't taste a thing. That's how it was when the chills began imprisoning me under blankets those next few days, and it only got worse once the medicine went to work knocking me out. While asleep, I was away in the old neighborhood, and when I woke I was lying in a white-walled moonscape. My dreams were more real than the world. Mom fried up toast and scrambled eggs the first morning in the new house to see if the stove worked, stabbing my nose with the scent of citrus when she poured the OJ down my glass. And I was sitting at the table that day with a woozy hot flu feeling, pulling apart a piece of toast on a napkin and not up for eating. So I just staggered back to the couch in the living room and slept another few hours after that. It's just that Broder's electric touch was all I could feel. It got into everything. There was little moving help I could give, so I spent the first day between sleeping and staring into space, noticing only in passing how the boxes emptied and the rooms filled. It was a surprise to see how many things we now had, and it took a while to realize it wasn't just the two of us, but Dad was moving in too. My grandparents certainly weren't going to help us move into their old house that day or any. When Dad brought my mattress in, Mom had me lie down upstairs in the half-story loft they said was my room, and I quickly got acquainted with the bathroom up there. I spent the first day over the bowl blowing chunks and the next few straining for any scrap left in me to blow. Coming away exhausted, I found sleep easy and stayed put, not wanting to leave the safety of that room, especially to go outside. But then there were the dreams. I'd be following Broder through a maze of upright game cabinets flashing bright and sounding off their warp spirals and gunshots in a dark video arcade. He'd tell me he was looking for his heart, and I'd find myself standing in a puddle of his blood. He'd circle around and in a calm voice say, "Eat it." So I'd pick the morsel up warm and dripping like a piece of meat and sink my teeth down. When I opened my eyes, the pillow was soaked with spit. There were too many dreams like that to write down in them days. Then night would roll in, and I'd usually be wide awake as my parents slept. I'd flip on the ceiling light, lie back on my mattress, and stare at it until it turned blue to my squint. Broder haunted every thought. The electric feeling of his fingers still sent shivers through my skin that would sink all the way to my gut. I'd grind my teeth just picturing his face. I was still bleeding rectally, but Mom and Dad would never know. It would only get me and him in trouble, I knew it. It was too embarrassing to tell anyone. The next day it was just cereal. The birds chirped outside, Saturday cartoons zapped in from the next room, and for the first time in days I felt some warm sunlight as it streamed in through the kitchen window. By then most of the big furniture had been moved into place and the cupboards were stocked. That morning Dad was sitting beside me at the table and mumbling something about the house. The cereal arrived and Mom poured milk on it because I was too sluggish to do it myself, as Dad grudgingly looked on. I could sense he was going to get on my case any second about being old enough to do it myself, but he didn't say anything. Instead, he began chewing his cereal loudly, interrupting himself with deep guttural swallows, snorting sighs and grunts. He even lifted his bowl with one hand and started shoveling the flakes in with the spoon, blowing bubbles and letting it roll down his chin. He glanced at me every couple seconds to see if I was catching it, and Mom just looked on from the corner, mildly amused. A few more seconds into his slurping and he began to choke, and that's when he really got me to grin. He rested the bowl back down on the table and started cracking up, and that's when I felt a smile stretch the stiff muscles of my face for the first time in days. August 14th, 1981. Broder had my skateboard, and he was riding it on my driveway. But then I had to get ready for school. I got lost, so I went in an arcade with the sun and moon on the ceiling, and up some black and white steps to a game that was an eye. It was Broder's upstairs room, but we were at the laps too, at the same time. He was a shadow breathing on my neck. He grabbed my shoulder and... Dad brought Corner Boy home a few days later. After napping an hour sickly on the couch one day, I opened my eyes to see this small, black-haired, freckled kid lying chest down on the floor before the TV, just like me. He rested his chin in his palms, just like I would have done if I were where he was. Thick-framed black glasses hung on his face, poking up beneath his bangs, and his t-shirt had a green frog painted on the front. He couldn't have been more than 6 years old, and yet everything from his coal black hair to his Velcro sneaks all looked so similar that for a moment I wondered if I was still dreaming. But no, for real, there on the floor was this smaller me. I lifted off the couch that moment in silence and wobbled forth once my eyes adjusted. The house was empty, but I met Mom outside raking old leaves from under the porch with her hands. When she saw me staggering down the concrete path, she broke from her work on all fours and wiped her forehead. "Well, it's happened. We finally got a good place to live for a change," she said, obviously overjoyed to see me out and about on the new property. "Did you say hi to Eliot?" "That's him. So he's living here now?" I asked. "He's living here now. He's got nowhere else. His mom's place is a drag." She straightened up on her knees and rubbed her hands together to brush off the dirt. "Where's Dad?" I asked. "Out with his mom." "Why?" she asked, crouching back down. "Do me a favor and be good to him, okay? Your brother. He's had it rough. Please. If you got issues with him, just take them out on me. Don't push him. He's kind of touchy." "Mom, I don't have issues with him, okay?" I huffed. She turned back to me and squinted her eyes, and I just stood there frustrated and feverish, trying to piece together how this whole living arrangement was going to work. He'd probably be stuck in my room, and his mom would visit, whoever she was. I hated how I'd more than likely be spending a lot of time with him because I didn't know anything about him other than how he ruined my life the day he was born. The last thing I wanted was to have him just hanging around me, but there was nothing I could do about it. It's not like I could stop him. "How are you feeling?" she asked. I said I don't have issues with it. It's not what I asked. "Yeah, I'll be good to him," I sighed. She went back to cleaning the gunk. "Good." When I stomped back into the den, I slouched down on the couch and spread my legs wide so that to my vantage I could fit the kid between my knees and crush him. He still rocked back and forth in the corner, sometimes kneeling, sometimes on all fours doing half somersaults, his eyes always stuck to the screen. To my eye he was nestled in my nook, looking totally oblivious to me, so that I didn't know if he was scared of me or if he even knew I was there. That kid just demanded to be seen, though. I felt his jumpy tremors in the floor on my electric skin, tingling me in weird and uncomfortable ways. Not surprisingly, my will to get out of the house began to grow soon after he moved in. One day I took a stroll along the sidewalk to get a sense of the new hood and to get away from him for a little while. Our street was busier than the quiet suburban back road I was used to. Properties were even more packed in and cars were parked on the street itself. I didn't see too many other kids around like I used to back at home. I guess that with the city right there, they all had places to go and the means to get there. The Aurora Expressway hummed through just a few side streets over. I stopped at the intersection and sat on the fire hydrant there just to enjoy the feeling of isolation for once, but my sightseeing was soon interrupted. A tug came at the back of my shirt, and I turned to see that kid they said was my half-brother, standing there right behind me. "She told me to come with you," he said. His eyes were magnified under those lenses. "You don't have to. I was just going back," I said, and stood to brush past him. "Are you my big brother?" he asked suddenly. I paused and turned back around to face him. The picture of what I had always wanted my brother to look like began to disappear right into the air, leaving this kid just standing there on the cracks of the cement in his high athletic shorts, t-shirt, and dorky glasses. What could I say? Was he my brother? "I don't know," I said. "Can you be?" he asked. "Maybe," I said. I guessed I had no choice. I didn't want to be rude. He was a kid after all. "Neat," he said. He seemed to really like the idea of having a big brother, and I couldn't blame him. It's pretty much all I wanted, too. Unfortunately for him, he didn't really get a big brother. He got me. And the way he was waddling on behind me that day, I think he would have followed me anywhere. But the only place I was willing to take him was back to the house. It looked like my day was spoiled. Certainly wasn't the last time he did that. I called him Corner Boy because no one but Dad could ever coax him out of the corner of whatever room he was in. In the living room, he tucked in behind the couch near the television, and in the half-story bedroom, he snuggled up next to the radiator below the window. Mom worked hard to drag him out in the open a few times, but he'd just cover his glasses with his palms to block her from sight and turn his head away. The kid must have been traumatized or something. His real name was Eliot, of course. And when he didn't budge, man did it ignite a few crazy fights in the house, something I hadn't seen since I was his age. It tended to happen at night in the stressful days after his mother's sudden disappearance. A few evenings around the kitchen table got so heated that the two of us couldn't stand to be there any longer and fled upstairs. I tried to get a hold of her all day, I remember Dad saying one night. She didn't answer her phone. I stopped by the hotel, nothing. I talked to her neighbors, and they say they haven't seen her in days. What do you expect me to do? So she abandoned him again, Mom said. Hold it, we don't know that. Then where is she? Look, as far as we know, she could be held up or on some park bench. There's nothing I can do about it. She'd call if she was picked up, right? It's just the same old story. You know how it goes. She dumps me with him and takes off. She don't care. Whatever, man. This is what you get. You did the same. Don't start that, all right? Don't start that. I don't want to hear it. I worked all day. I worked hard to make all this work. Where do you think this house is coming from? Your folks bought this house. It didn't come from her. It didn't come from you either. And so on and on it would go. That night I sat atop the stairs, bent over in the shadows, my forehead cradled in my arms, feeling like this whole family experiment was going to prove negative very soon. Any second, one of them could say something so personally cutting to the other that I'd be sleeping in the backseat of a car for the night for sure. She had a way of allowing herself to get so hurt that she'd use me to bring Dad to his knees, and then he would go ahead and push her that far just to prove his point. They always used me as a weapon against each other. They did it when I was 5, and they'd do it again. That night I was ready to go. I had my sneaks already on. The kid was whimpering somewhere in the bedroom's shadows behind me, and with the fighting downstairs it was too much for me to bear all at once. I stood and stomped to the bathroom, slammed the door, and ran the water blasting until a scolding and steam shot up to drown the noise of the fight downstairs. Then I plunked down on the toilet, rested my chin on my knuckles, and tried not to think about anything as the water gushed. The noise died down after 10 minutes, and I shut the water off. I couldn't keep my head up any longer. In the early days, that house was so empty there were hundreds of hiding places for my half-brother. But after a few minutes of searching, I found the kid sitting against the wall behind the bedroom's closet fold-out door. So I opened it. "No!" he yelled, casting it shut. What followed was like a wave of silence, and I strained to hear the few more curse words and mumblings from Dad as they broke in, the few more stubborn flips of the phone book pages, and banging furniture as they moved it on the linoleum floor downstairs. They were both very drunk by then. "He's only here because she knew you were choosing me," Mom continued. "Come on, man. She never gave that kid the time of day. I'm surprised she didn't just leave him in the box like she used to. Remember how she used to do that?" "You don't know what you're talking about," Dad said. "She can't just expect me to be his mother." "You weren't supposed to be," Dad said. "I walk into the room and he runs away. I talk to him and he runs away. I try to do things for him and he runs away. And I don't blame him. He doesn't know who the fuck I am. She can't expect me to fill the gap, man. I don't even know where to begin with him. Don't you know what that's like?" "Yeah, I totally do," Dad said. The boy now rocked back and forth as they went on like that downstairs. I could see him through the slats in the door at the right angle, but was at a loss for words whenever we locked eyes. He didn't know me and might not have known me much longer, so I didn't feel like soothing him, but at least I tried. I'm sure your mom will come back," I said, not knowing if it was okay to say that. "No, she won't. She never does," he said. For a kid as upset as he was, his voice was calm and direct. There was obviously more going on with him than I had realized. It was almost as if he didn't really care if he ever saw her again, and was just more frightened by the fighting. Dad was the only one he ever seemed to cling to. He didn't like being left alone with anyone else, and preferred to be alone if Dad wasn't around, at least in the early days. "It's too big here. I don't like it this big," he said. After that he quieted down, but I still hung around that closet door where he was. The thought of sharing that room with him now made me feel like the new neighborhood could have been on another planet and it wouldn't have made a difference. Just knowing he was as confused and scared and lonely as I was had me feeling right for the first time since we moved, that he was having a tough time with all of this too. For the first time in my life it wasn't just my feelings at stake. I lay on my mattress and rested my head against the wall, struggling to keep my eyes open. A desk lamp blazed on the floor in the corner of the empty room and cast a twisted shadow up the walls and slanted ceiling. The summer night silence grew so intense I could hear crickets chirping out the window, and I wriggled on my soft sheets in the heat. He was watching me the whole time, feeling me out. The next morning I saw that he had dragged his blankets and couch cushions over to the radiator in the corner where he had curled himself up in a ball that night. He still wore that little green frog shirt and those same high athletic shorts like they were the only clothes he had. "Yeah, kid. Sometimes they don't come back," I whispered, stretching in the sheets. August 17th, 1981. It happened again. I was lying in bed and couldn't move, and Broder was just sitting on the bed staring at me. He didn't move. He just stared at me, and his eyes were so big, like Corner Boy's eyes. And he never blinked. I couldn't move, and there was something going up and down my back, just feeling it, like a snake, and it burned. He went away when I woke up. Corner Boy only took food on the floor, where he sat in front of the refrigerator, because he had never lived in a house with a kitchen table before. He didn't feel comfortable sitting up high in a chair like a person either. Those nights at the end of the summer, we all sat around the table bowing our heads and biting each other's off every time someone opened their mouths, but he avoided all of that just by sitting on the floor, like he knew what he was doing. I ended up learning far more things about him because of his oddities than I did for any other reason. At that time, Mom was restless in a job search, and Dad was waiting for a contact from the kid's mother. Everyone was a nervous wreck and trying to make it work, us all living together, that is, and nobody was in the mood for any jokers. I just leaned back in my chair, roll my fork between my fingers, and try to pass off the sparks in the silence whenever they ignited. Sometimes I'd catch Eliot's eyes in my field of vision from my seat at the table, and turn away embarrassed. He sat on the floor with his plate between his legs, swaying back and forth and burping constantly. Dad had trained him well. "Hi, big brother," he'd whisper, and I'd look away almost reflexively. Then he'd burp a few more times for kicks. That kid was like that. He threw things back in my face that once would have had me by impulse alone, and at first all we seemed to bond over were his bodily noises. Seriously, the kid never stopped. Whatever he did, he'd instantly look to me to gauge my reaction, and if I smirked, he'd do it more. Despite how off in his own world he was a quirky kid back here on Earth with a full head of hair and his own liquid groove going in every move. He mumbled every thought past his brain, and lay some nights in the blankets on the floor rambling on to no one. But if anyone ever asked him a question, there was no force possible to unlock his lips. He'd sit there on the bedroom rug talking to his toys. He didn't like being alone, but when we were with him, he never wanted to do much with anyone outside his own head. It's like he just needed to know others were there. I did try to be a good big brother for him at first. We even had some fun together. Things that had long slipped away and now seemed silly to me were back in my face whenever he was around. He still sang the cartoon tunes and the commercial jingles I once had stuck in my head, and he still cared whether the cereal popped in the milk or if the matchbox could make the block tower tumble. It was like watching my life in replay. A dream day was video comics on TV and cheese crackers for lunch. It was one full of pretend space shooters and showing off your superpowers in the backyard. It was one familiar to me from all those I had had, except Dad was actually there for him in his, and it was that fact alone that started eating away at me. Before we went to bed each night, we'd drive his cars around on the floor in our bedroom, crashing them, turning them over, and flying them around in the air with mouthed explosions thrown in for effect. We didn't say much in the early days because we were still learning our limits. It all came forward in explosive saliva. Soon I was hoisting him up by the arms, bear-hugging him around the waist, giving him light spanks and taps, pushes and tugs, and pinning him into submission up against the wall for kicks. There was nothing wrong with it then. We sometimes had to force him to come down for dinner, and then all he'd have to say about it was, I was frozen, or they had to freeze me so I could make the trip. Then he'd show up wearing his tube socks on his arms, a belt under his pits, and my old skateboard helmet propped loose on his head altogether like some kind of makeshift spacesuit, which is what he said it was. His love for all things lasers and spaceships started making sense when I heard that Dad had already taken him to see The Empire Strikes Back that year, which I did eventually get to see with Dad, but we had to take Eliot along, so we got to see it twice. He seemed to get everything. I'd catch him lying back in his bunk, stretching out 3 fingers on each hand and swirling them around for hours to simulate spaceflight while spitting his own explosions in. Then it wasn't long before he was given some actual Star Wars toys to play with, the figurines and the AT-AT walker and such, and he'd run circles around the backyard flying them. Dad also gave him 3 of his old sci-fi pulp books from when he was a kid, and Eliot would spend hours flipping through them, coloring in them, smudging them, and basically tearing them apart, making sure I'd never get to read them. They were all fantastic and amazing sci-fi adventure titles with colorful illustrations, and of course he's the one who got to have them. Dad never thought to give them to me, like everything else, or if I might have liked them too, but it was too late by then. And so it wasn't long before I started feeling like the other son. Before school started, we both received a batch of new clothes and some workspace, and soon he had a plastic table on his side with a line of toys against the wall, and I had my new desk and bookshelf by the door, so the kingdom was divided. The cluster of sheets on the floor gave way to bunk beds along the tall wall, which meant Dad had to train Eliot to sleep in one by himself over those next few weeks. The kid had never slept in a bed alone before and always needed someone to sleep with, and that usually meant me. I got used to him crawling in beside me, like he hadn't taken over enough of my room. Right after the start of school that year, the kid's reality finally became clear. His mother was not coming back. Dad got a call, and I overheard my parents talking about it one morning as I dressed. His mom was found dead in an Ontario gas station bathroom from an overdose, and I could only anticipate the shock Eliot was going to have when he heard the news. But days passed and no one told him. They just carried on like it never happened, like the kid didn't even deserve to know. And then came the clincher. One morning Dad dressed in a suit and tie and left the house alone, even kissing the kid on the head before heading out. He didn't come home for a few hours after that. He always did his dirty work in the open. "Why haven't you told him?" I asked Mom one day from the passenger side on the way back from school. "Because we don't want the caseworkers coming around thinking he was with her when she overdosed. That's why. He not knowing anything rules it out. It's better we don't tell him and get in trouble for that than tell him and maybe get in trouble for stuff that isn't even true, like keeping drugs around him or something. You gotta be careful when you have kids. The state doesn't listen to people like us," she explained. "So I can't tell him nothing either, right?" I asked. "You do and he's gonna blow. The kid's traumatized or something, man. You tell him and he'll be coming for us in our sleep." Seriously, his mom used to keep him in a box. And I wish I was joking about that. Let him find out from them. Let them be the one to crush him with that news. Crushing kids is what they're good at. "He's had a shit life, but that just tends to happen to people who know your dad," she said. I sighed. I wanted to tell that kid everything, but it'd make no sense to get into how his mom had died if to him her death was no different than every time she had slept in on him behind a locked bathroom door. There was nothing I could do to stop his little brain from exploding at the news, and I didn't think I should have been the one to break it to him anyways. It wasn't my business. If he was happy, that was good enough, no matter how he tossed and called for her in his sleep. He never did that awake. Like me, he had his own secrets. In those days, the other kids ignored me at the new school, and it didn't take long to fit right in like I'd been there all along once I'd gotten lost down 20 different hallways. Those linoleum locker corridors, floor-to-ceiling windows, and the lobbies and beat-up lunch tables etched with dicks and swear words never changed no matter what school you went to. Not even the faces did, just the hallways. Eliot started first grade and came into trouble the minute he crawled in on his hands and knees. Mom started her new job and attended night school for paralegal work while Dad pulled his new 9-to-5 working a desk at a bank to support us. It didn't take long to realize that my parents worked better side by side than together on anything, and nothing about our living arrangement even suggested we were a real family. Mom did nothing to get custody of Eliot back then. We all lived separate lives under one roof. Then Eliot turned 7 and traded crawling around for rolling. I had bought a cheap replacement skateboard for myself with some funds I scraped off Mom, and it wasn't long before he took that away from me too, as usual. At first he used it to roll himself around the house chest down, clambering across the floor like the lizard he was, and since anything that could get him out of the bedroom closet seemed like a good idea to everyone, my skateboard quickly became his skateboard. Then he actually took to 2 legs and wobbled around in the balancing act that was standing straight up on the thing. We no longer had to drag him by the arm, and he no longer crawled on hands and knees or crept up and down the stairs. He preferred walking, and for the first time in his life, thanks to me. From then on, he spent every afternoon that autumn rolling the street on what once had been my board, shouting "Jared" every time he passed the house, and I took it as a taunt. I'd wave from the bathroom window in the front as I did my homework in there just so I could keep an eye on my board. Sometimes it was algebra when he was on the way up and social studies on the way back, but he never tired of throwing it in my face, his energy lasting long into the late evening spent pumping my board beneath the streetlights before he had to stop. I thought he did everything he could to make sure I never got it. "Hey, kiddo," I'd holler back. Every night he'd play with his toys and watch his favorite shows, never seeming to have any idea what he was doing to me day after day on the inside, just being stuck with him all the time. When he got home those days, he'd push my skateboard under the bed near the ladder like it was his. He'd climb up to his bunk, the top one I wanted, and I'd sit there on mine, feeling like I could have so easily pushed him off that damn ladder, and nobody would have had to know it wasn't an accident. He was that easy to throw, and he'd be all for it as long as I told him it was a game. He liked to play all kinds of games. Soon the leaves fell. As the days grew shorter, time spent at school seemed longer, and the afternoons only took up a couple hours before night crept in cold and dark out the window. That's when Eliot and I found ourselves together in the bedroom more often and left on our own. He was always worn out and under the sheets before me, and then he'd be up playing on the floor a few hours later, always disturbing my sleep with his racket, which sucked because I had to get up earlier than him. We had a lot of time by ourselves that night. "So what do you think happens when you die?" I asked him one day on the way to the corner store for snacks in the dead of winter. It was the weekend, which meant we were alone, and I always had to cart him around with me, babysitting him basically. We had been forced to walk on the damp road, for the sidewalks were loaded up with snow. The late wind bit up my nose and ears, and sifted the top layer of fluff off the banks to blow stinging on our faces as we passed through the spray. "Daddy says you go to be with God forever," he answered. Countless times the topic of death had come up over dinner, and was fast swept under the table with a few hard looks and buttoned lips. There's no way by then he hadn't gotten the hint 100 times that something was different about the very air when the issue of his mom came up. The things he'd say to me every night could convince anyone, about how she was not on Earth and somewhere in the clouds, the little bits about death he picked up on TV. I wasn't sure how much it bothered him, but that day I couldn't resist the possibility of blowing him up with a few simple words like Mom had said would happen. Little did I know, though, he was already onto it. "My mommy's dead," he said suddenly, as if he'd been storing that confession up for months. "They talked to me about it a long time ago at school. Daddy doesn't know yet, and I don't want him to be sad, so I didn't tell him yet." "He knows," I said. The boy froze ghost-like where he stood by the snowpack and fell backwards on it. He closed his eyes, his breath failing. I could only imagine what he was thinking about our dad. "You okay?" I asked. He rose from the snow and nodded before continuing on. His face flat and his shoulders slouched, and all I could do was keep walking. That's all it took to devastate him. The tension he brought home that day stayed all afternoon with him at the bedside. Mom and Dad hovered around trying to comfort him as he threatened to run away, but he only started crying when they left. I sat lonely on my bottom bunk in the darkened room watching what I had caused. "Why'd you tell him?" Dad asked. "He knew," I said, feeling vindicated at last. Dad got an apology from me, his other son, but Eliot didn't get his. So he spent that winter grieving, the death of his trust in our dad. Good, I thought. Now we're even.